Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora. Welcome in. Peter, it's great to see you. Absolutely loving your new outfit there, the shirt.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's this one is actually, we got into trouble, or I got into trouble with a number of people when I took you shopping and you were wearing your lovely outfit from Crane Brothers. And
Shopping
I thought,
local,
and
buy,
I thought,
buy something, live in it for the rest of my life.
Yep. And I thought, bugger them, actually, because they're not sponsoring it. They're not paying for it. And there might be Kaka subscribers, so we don't want them to not see you beautifully dressed. But yeah, I picked it up the other day from Superette in Ponsonby Road, and I really like it. But last night I was at an event, and the Mayor of Auckland, Wayne Brown, who I'd never met before, said to me, "Oh, you could get that much cheaper in Otahuhu."
Oh, good fun.
Yeah.
He knows the class. He knows all about class in Auckland, and he's putting you in your place there, Peter.
Yes, he is. He seemed to be quite liberal about putting me in my place, but I'm not going to be as rude as I feel like about him, because maybe we'll want to get him on at some point.
Oh, we'll have him on the show.
But I did have a conversation with him about a few things, like Auckland Transport and why he doesn't like certain journalists. But it was, I did say to him that I wasn't actually at work, but it was at Helen Clark's party, Bernard. And
Friend of the show? Yeah.
Friend of the show, exactly. But so Helen, who, and I just to be clear here, I was acting as the MC for the event last night, rather than covering it as a journalist, and it was fun, grateful to do it. And she said essentially that I was doing it as a favour to her because she'd come on the Hoon. But she said, "I recommend the Hoon. It's a hoot."
It's a hoot. Oh, I love it. No, that's great. The Hoon is a hoot. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Indeed.
Exactly. And it was so delightful, though, because there were so many, it was an interesting group of people, many academics, people who donate to the Helen Clark Foundation, all sorts of people from across Auckland, pretty much. And many of them, a remarkable number of them actually, Bernard, said, "We just love the Hoon."
Oh,
and so
great.
I thought, and I always find that, and I always want to give you that feedback, including one of them was from Waiheke, and we have to go to their restaurant soon because he's a very, very interesting and nice chap. So I'll come over and we'll hang out and meet him, because it is really great when people say that they like what we're trying to do. And funnily enough, we won that award last week, or got the silver award which is remarkable given who else is in it. Although I haven't seen who the judges are. And I listened to the one that won the gold award, and it was actually very good. There was a very good piece with a guy, an academic from Australia, who's an expert on the Atlas network. But it was very blokey, whereas I don't think we are as such.
Yeah, we like to have a wide variety.
Anybody else's podcast, but
we like to have a wide variety of people on, and we're looking forward to doing that this week. We've got Catherine Dyer back, our climate correspondent, to talk about some of the big climate news in the last couple of weeks, and the government's been doing things and not doing things, which we can talk about. I'll have a good old crack at what's going on with the government politically, economically, and in its various policy guises. We hope that we'll have a special guest on at the end of the show to talk about, in particular, this announcement about the Marsden Fund, which sounds like everyone was talking about it last night.
You mean is that the Marsden Point Fund?
The halving of the funds for the Marsden science projects, and the complete withdrawal of government funding for humanities and social sciences pure research, which has really stirred up a lot of discontent, anger, just disbelief. Apart from anything else, it looks like the universities and the institutions weren't given any warning.
Yep.
There was no consultation. Even the science advisors, the previous one under the previous national government, we understand, didn't get told. We've just seen a piece from Juliet Gerard, the outgoing science advisor, talking about the decisions and how short-sighted and damaging it will be, and it certainly is something that speaks to the government's approach, which is to dial back on anything involving so-called non-essential spending, and to focus completely on reducing debt and deficits, because their main focus is using that
but
headroom.
also focusing on economic growth. And
well,
so
in theory,
only STEM subjects apparently
yes,
contribute to the economy, Bernard.
yes. So
And yet
all of that.
that's so. I mean, would this include, for example, one of the great? Well, we can discuss this when you get Troy on. But would this include something like the Dunedin
Study.
time
Exactly.
study? Would it include
Yeah.
something like that, or would that be allowed because it's health? Because that is just a gigantic New Zealand achievement that has incredible knock-on effects.
Yeah. I mean, for example, the whole social investment approach that the government uses depends on the sorts of research that social scientists do into how government policies affect people. What are what is the social science of our society, and how it's progressing, and how it affects our health and our emissions and all of these things? That's been completely removed. The idea that somehow only mathematicians and engineers and pure, chemical, biological, physical scientists are the ones who can generate anything useful. I mean, you only have to look at how much money the government spends subsidizing the international movie industry to know that culture matters.
And except, of course, we have an incredible, we theoretically punch above our weight in those areas. I was talking to somebody in the social sciences area last night, in the social welfare area, and New Zealand has some of the best academic work in that area, because we have such an interesting kind of microcosm of racial things that contribute to inequity that contributes to inequity. It is incredibly short-sighted. And partly in preparation for this, Bernard, I re-listened, because I nearly died watching it on Saturday or Sunday, the Q&A interview with Christopher Luxon and Jack Tame. And I imagine Jack has been criticised by people for being too persistent and pushy, but Christopher Luxon was entirely out of his depth on detail, on analysis. And what I'd say to you, Bernard, is that Kiwis...
I think it was an average of once every minute in that interview.
Yeah, well, and also the smirking. And what I'd say to you, Bernard, is the Kiwis are doing the hard yards, and it's all Jacinda's fault. It was one of the most ludicrous. I mean, he could be the next Todd Muller.
Well, he's.
I mean, I hope he doesn't burst a gasket. I'm not wishing a breakdown on him, but.
Well, it's interesting. In the last week, we've seen 3 poll results: a new one from Stuff and Freshwater Research, one from Roy Morgan, and the internal so-called poll from Talbot Mills, showing the government's lead over the combined opposition dramatically falling. And interestingly, the centre left in a couple of those polls are now ahead or neck and neck. Certainly, Christopher Luxon's personal popularity is at very low levels for someone who's been the Prime Minister for his first year. Usually is some sort of honeymoon for a new Prime Minister. That's definitely not happened. Chris Hipkins is ahead of Luxon as preferred Prime Minister,
which
in
is
a couple
pretty
of those
extraordinary,
polls,
because he's basically subterranean at the moment.
Yeah, and we're also seeing that the Te Pāti Māori is equal with ACT in this poll that's come out from Roy Morgan.
I mean, that's a very because I think I said to you the other day that I wouldn't be surprised if at the next election that David Seymour emerged actually as the Prime Minister. So maybe I'm being unfair to the entire New Zealand. Oh yeah, good eye rolling there. Nice eye rolling, Catherine. Yeah, and that, but maybe I'm just being too negative about my fellow Kiwis. So what I would say to you, Bernard, is that Kiwis have been doing the hard yards, and we're focusing on KPIs and the economy. Speaking of KPIs, Catherine, we're about to abandon some very important climate KPIs. It would appear, right?
Yes. Catherine, tell us about these comments that have come out from Todd McClay and how it all fits into the government's approach on climate.
Yeah, so they've announced today that they don't have any intention of buying international offsets in order to meet our 2030 commitments under the Paris Agreement. They say that they're looking at other ways to do that domestically. But what I would say about that is that there is no credible way to do that. You can maybe do some dodgy accounting and you can maybe submit a reduced target, or at least try, although that goes against the Paris Agreement's intentions. But to me, that's just another way of saying that you're reneging. So, I don't know why they don't just announce that they're reneging on their Paris Agreement targets, because that's in effect what they're saying. And even in terms of, if you look at their actions since they've been voted in, they show no intention to do things that will decrease our emissions. Instead, they're doing things, particularly in, say, the transport sector, which will increase our emissions over time.
And in the fast track projects.
And in the fast track projects, there's a whole range of ways in which they're, actively increasing our emissions over time. So it's not credible to claim that they can achieve our Paris Agreement commitments for 2030 without buying international offsets. So that what they have in effect announced is that they intend to renege, and that is.
But they haven't. But who is holding them apart from you, Bernard, and me? Who is holding them to account on this? Because we've talked about this 10 or 12 times during the last period in the Hoon. I am very critical of James Shaw and setting us up for this, for the $18 billion odd that we would have to buy in overseas carbon credits, which I just thought that was always untenable. But I don't see them being taken to account on this yet.
I think there were credible paths to reducing that load by doing more domestically to reduce our emissions. And I think that if you did ask James Shaw, that was probably what he would say was the intention. But that's just not happening, with the current government. So I don't know if he said, I wouldn't say necessarily that he set us up. I think that was the backstop for how you get there. But you make progress over time in terms of increasing your domestic emissions. It's just that stopped happening.
And am I right in thinking, Catherine, that we haven't heard of anything from the actual climate change minister? This has all come from other ministers.
Yeah, that's right. That's another thing that's a bit. And it is weird that his feet aren't being held to the fire a little more strongly than is currently the case, because what their message at the moment is simply not credible, and they are, in one way or another, signalling that they intend to renege on our Paris Agreement targets. And even, when Christopher Luxon was being interviewed by Jack Tame on Q&A, he was saying, we're still committed to the 2050 targets. But what's the point of that? He's not going to be around.
2030, did he?
No, he refused to commit to the 2030 ones. Yeah. And 2030 is the way station that you need to meet on the way to 2050. So if you cannot hit the way stations, then you probably cannot hit the 2050 target.
Correct.
And the truth of the matter is that Luxon won't be around to be held accountable for that by 2050 So
that was exactly my reaction to it, Catherine. And that they're waiting. I have been waiting for them to wait for a much bigger, important country to say this is done. We're not doing this. It's never going to happen, which I suspect we might get on about January the 10th, something like that, from the United States.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they'll be talking to other countries or trying to get in the midst of a flock so that they don't get noticed too much. But that announcement, the cat is out of the bag. They have already announced, as good as announced, that they are reneging on the 2030 Paris Agreement targets. It's a done deal.
How can we write this better, Bernard? Because I don't think that's understood.
Yeah, well, we certainly need
Catherine's doing it. The exclusive audience of the Hoon is hearing it. But it is a de facto reneging on the Paris Agreement. And New Zealand actually, therefore, would be, if we take that, it'll be one of the first signatories to say, actually, we're just not going to do it. We can't do it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely worth forwarding on all of this material to the trade ministers for the United Kingdom and the European Union, who signed trade agreements with us quite recently, in which we were required to meet our Paris Agreement targets to keep the free trade agreements. Now, Todd McClay, the guy who's come out today and said, is in charge of those agreements and in charge of our trade and our agriculture. For him to do that is really just giving the fingers to the United Kingdom and the European Union. And we've got to be a little bit careful about this, because remember that Donald Trump will be the president in a few weeks' time, and is promising to apply at least 10% tariffs to everyone. He is very rigorous in saying anyone who's competing with an American business is going to get my help through the tariff system. He came out just yesterday and outright opposed a Japanese takeover bid for a big American steel company, even though Japan is one of America's top allies in its contest with China. Also, he's not shy of saying, well, I said 25% tariffs for Canada from Mexico. I'm happy to add another 10% to the ones already there and in China, maybe go to 60%. Even talked about 100% tariffs for Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. We risk being chopped out here if we join up with AUKUS, which is what the current government seems to...
Are you moving Catherine into Robert's session?
I
For God's sake, Bernard, bring it back to climate.
I think everything is always about the climate.
And no, you don't. You think everything's about housing, but cut away.
But if we solve the housing problem, we solve the climate problem. And if we solve the climate problem, we solve the housing problem. And everything in the end comes back to how we approach climate, transport, housing, electricity, the whole bit. And at the moment, our foreign policy is aligned with America. And the Chinese have been, they're starting to kick back. So, for example, just this week, they banned exports of a bunch of
precious metals, rare earths, rather.
Yeah, rare earths, antimony, and a whole bunch of things that you need to make chips and do all sorts of other fancy high tech. And they are pretty hardcore on this stuff. They've already warned us that if we join AUKUS, it will affect our relationship with China. So we have a prime minister out there saying we're on America's side. We don't care what China does with our trade. And then one of his ministers has gone to Europe and the UK and say, we don't care about the climate. We don't care what you're going to do with our trade. So who are we going to trade with?
Yeah, we're victims.
And so it's not only the wrong thing to do. It's dangerous for our trade relations and our security, for our trade and agriculture minister to give the fingers to two of the organisations, or the two of the trade partners we will need if we lose parts of America and China. So it's incredibly reckless and cynical, because you're absolutely right, Catherine. They are just waiting. They're just waiting for someone else to do it so they can get,
but they've done it.
No
and
choice.
I just don't see that being called out. Sorry, Catherine, I didn't mean to interrupt you, because you've barely been able to get a word in edgewise when Bernard just went off on one. He's doing a soliloquy, but carry on. A wide-ranging soliloquy.
Yeah, well, the other thing, of course, is, the government's funding cuts to research this week. It's been a real 1, 2, 3 kick in the guts this week from the government for me, for academics, for people in this position. So with the Marsden funding, they're decommissioning the social science and humanities panels, and they're saying that the only research that they'll fund is basically STEM research, and 50% of that has to be directed towards increasing something that improves economic growth, which is just, I mean, first of all, I think people need to really think about the kind of research that we are losing in this mix, and that includes things like how do we adapt to climate change and become more resilient, because that is social science research for the most part. There is, all sorts of things about in those research cuts, for instance, looking at misinformation and disinformation and how it affects us, the effects of social media, the effects of AI on society. There's just so many things that you end up not being able to fund because of that decision to defund. And also, possibly most importantly, a lot of the social science and humanities research is looking at is providing evidence-based policy advice to government and
Yes.
considering the impact of government
Evidence-based,
policies and
exactly.
decisions on people. And so what the government is actually saying is we don't want to hear any of that. We don't want to hear any criticisms of what we're doing. We don't want to hear what you think we ought to be doing. We don't care what impact it has on society, and we don't want you researching it so that you can throw the evidence at us.
Yeah.
You know,
It's-
so
I
that
mean,
is a very chilling message from
Do
the
we think
government
of
that's
you
been
as an
sent.
academic, Catherine, in this regard?
Yeah, I'm employed full time as a lecturer in climate change. So, yep, you can.
I mean, it's not, and it's been interesting how wide the reaction has been throughout the academic community. So it's not just been the social scientists who've jumped up and said, "Hey, we've got all sorts of people, some of whom who benefit from the actual changes," and you know, it just speaks to this approach. We are now a housing market with bits tacked on, where the government's total approach.
Bring this back to housing. Yep.
Yeah.
Where the
But
government's
even-
total approach is to focus utterly on
Yeah.
reducing debt and deficits to essentially get mortgage rates down and to provide benefits to those people who make money out of our residential housing market. On a
Can
week
we
where
leave your
we've-
soliloquy about this to the end of the show
Sure,
when we have the other chap on, Bernard? Because
I just say
Go for it,
even people who are doing pure scientific research, physical scientific research in the climate area, for instance, are saying, you know, I've heard them say that research is largely pointless if it isn't wrapped up in the social, political, cultural changes that you need in order to get that research implemented. So they're going to end up spending a whole bunch of money on stuff that doesn't go anywhere because, as we already have done, we have all the technology we need to address climate change. We just don't do it. And it's research on why we're not actually implementing it and doing it
and we're
that
in
is
an
critical
incredibly
to
good
making
position
progress.
to lead on it.
Yeah.
And we're in a
as
good
we
position
move
to lead on it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, not going forward, apparently. Even Robert will be impacted by this, political science and international relations and social
nice
science.
segue.
Wow, fantastic.
I actually sent Robert a message. Robert, welcome. It's so lovely to see you again. Nice
Good
cup,
afternoon,
by
yeah,
the way.
and
And have you got vodka
I absolutely
in
agree
there,
with
or
everything
a good-
Catherine's just said.
Yeah. Have you got vodka in the keep calm and carry on cup, or have you got?
Oh, I'm afraid I'll have to vouch for water this time. So
Yeah,
no vodka or gin.
Okay. So how will this affect you? Or does it affect you
well,
at all?
it won't affect me personally too much, but I just want to echo what's been said. I think this is the idea that you can compartmentalize research in science from other sectors is ludicrous. I did a book with a scientist, Professor Lloyd Davis, published in 2015 called Science Diplomacy. And if there's one thing that came out of that book, and it was many scientists contributed to it, is that to get on top of problems like climate change, you do have to draw on a multidisciplinary approach. And this seems to have escaped the current government, which is very
and a
sad.
multilateral approach, absolutely too, right? Which is
Yeah,
I'm
well,
sorry,
but I
I'm
mean, let's
pushing
just
you
take
towards
it-
doing international affairs.
Yeah, but as Catherine has just quite rightly said, it hasn't been a lack of science that has led to stalemate in tackling, or stagnation in leading in tackling climate change. There's been a lack of political will, and there's been a lack of diplomatic skill, if you like, in delivering that outcome. So it is puzzling why the government's taken this position, and I mean, I'm not sure how many other countries have gone down this route of trying to compartmentalise and privilege one sector of research over another when they're actually linked.
Yes, absolutely. It seems very kind of ignorant, like deliberately ignorant.
Yeah, I mean,
And
just
or naive.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that struck me is that I think Judith Collins, the Defence Minister, said amongst other things, we really must focus on, defence technologies, but also we're becoming an emerging space actor. Very true, but if you're going to look at systems of accountability for our participation in space, for example, you're going to need the expertise. People like Dr. Maria Pozza, who's a world-leading expert on international space law. You can't compartmentalise those people out of it. Otherwise, you're going to go into both climate change negotiations as well as negotiations relating to our participation in space relatively blind. And that's not going to be in the national interest. So I hope the government does have a chance to think again.
You two kids have been doing a brilliant job of segueing between Catherine and you and giving us your both perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Stay
Lovely
on,
to
Robert.
see you.
Thank you.
So you can, of course, stay on the background if you wish, Catherine, and send me brickbats and bouquets if you wish.
Let Simon decide in the background.
Robert, I was
We
saying
invite our audience to do that, and they will.
Yeah, but I'm the only one who actually looks at what the audience is telling us, and they love Robert and they really appreciate Catherine. Robert, I've realised that I've been feeling rather low since the election of Donald Trump, and one of the things that I've decided to do is read more books than read the news, and I have spent a ridiculous amount of time this week reading a new book by James Holland on Monte Cassino, and it's enormous. And then I have another book that's sort of in my Jenga of unread books, which is Judgment at Tokyo, which is about the Tokyo equivalent, the Japanese equivalent of the Nuremberg trials. Because when I look at what's happening, we're just going to do a little 2-minute, 5-minute session on Trump and what we've seen since he was there, and the flood of people into Mar-a-Lago. Justin Trudeau turning up this week after he threatened tariffs on Canada. And did you see the story? I was going to make it the skateboarding dog, but it's Trump said, "Oh, why don't we just make Canada the 51st state of the United States?"
Did he say that?
Well, I can tell you one thing: that wouldn't have been received with enormous
Prime Minister
enthusiasm in Canada.
Yeah, but let's remember he did want to buy Greenland from the Danes. You know, there's weirder things have happened in Trump. This is the whole stuff is so mind bending.
Yeah, but the problem with living a life like Mr. Trump, where no one's really ever said no to you, is that you just keep coming up with ever more fantastical projects and get shocked when they get knocked back. He seemed, this is the guy who appeared on, the reality show The Apprentice, where he interviewed candidates for jobs, and he'd never been for a job interview in his own life. This is an extraordinary, surreal individual.
I don't think we also want to get into the areas where somebody has said no to Donald Trump and he's just pushed ahead. One of the
he usually fires them, actually.
Yeah.
I was thinking of something a bit more intimate than that, but thinking of one of the appointments. We've talked, I think, when Elaine was on, about the Peter Hegseth appointment, which looks like it's going to slide away to his putting this rat bag with his crusader tattoos and his rather colourful sex life, that he will slide away. He'll be removed from that job of Defence Secretary. But the appointment this week, or the proposed appointment this week, of Charles Kushner, Jared Kushner's dad, so Ivanka's father-in-law, as ambassador to Paris, seemed rather extraordinary, given that he's a complete rotter. He set his brother-in-law up with a prostitute in order to, win a financial disagreement with him. This guy's a crook, and he was pardoned by Trump at the last minute.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much you can add to that, really, Peter. I mean, it's a bit of a conversation stopper. It's in another era, it just would not be acceptable. But unfortunately, we've gone down the path now in the last decade or so, where the unthinkable has become thinkable. This is a person with no diplomatic expertise or experience, and as you've indicated, has had a few encounters with the law, and is there because there's a billionaire and a good part of the Trump inner circle. This is, by the way,
he served jail. He was in jail for 2.5 years.
He was in jail, right? But
even Trump hasn't seen the inside. I mean,
what
interesting was Trump said about marrying somebody in jail? Let's see how they feel when they have to get married to somebody in jail.
But the interesting thing, though, if we can, apart from the cronyism, this is actually going to make for a disastrous beginning for the government. I know Mr. Trump always takes the lesson from his last administration that, representatives of the deep state held him back. those people who were dangerously independent and weren't American firsters. But by surrounding himself with people who are unfit to do these positions and are loyal to Mr. Trump, Trump's going to find himself with a crisis on his hands very rapidly, because he's going to be surrounded by people who are largely out of their depth. And it will not reflect well on his leadership. So it's going to be interesting. I predict now that he's going to be sacking in his first,
which he did last time. Yes.
Yeah, it's a relentless search for both loyalty and competence, and the two don't go hand in hand, unfortunately, for Mr. Trump.
Did you see also, Robert, the appointment of Mr. Boulos, who is the father-in-law of Tiffany Trump, who's the one that we never hear from with her rather addled looks, is being appointed as his advisor on the Middle East. And Mr. Boulos is a Lebanese billionaire who runs basically the car business in Nigeria. I mean,
so how many billionaires, Peter, you should know this, how many billionaires has the current administration got lined up? I think it seems to
11.
be once again
11 about
11
my count. Yeah.
This is really anti-establishment. This is
Absolutely.
leading the charge against the establishment.
They're looking after the working man, Robert.
Oh, I know. And the billionaires know how to do that, don't they?
Yes. Speaking of billionaires, we have Vladimir Putin now rubbing his hands together, waiting for the inauguration of Donald Trump, and Ukraine holding on by its fingertips, it seems, to whatever territorial gains they can get, because the drums are beating for a forced negotiation and settlement. Robert, what do you think's what are we shaping up for in the next 6 weeks?
There's mixed messages there, Bernard. There's certainly the anticipation in Moscow, or there was, that Trump was going to deliver the sort of deal that Mr. Putin wants. But now there seems to be a conflicting message that the Putin people are very unhappy with some of the messages they're getting. They're very unhappy with some of the appointments that Mr. Trump's made. He's, I think it was a general, is it Kellogg, who's been appointed as his envoy to Ukraine, who's wants to arm Ukraine even more. And secondly, he's appointed Marco Rubio as his Secretary of State, who also is actually quite, although he opposed the $61 billion package for Ukraine, I don't know if he's had a rethink, but he certainly is indicated subsequently that he doesn't believe that Ukraine can back down on its territorial integrity. So there's some interesting things here. There was, and I know we covered this previously, but there was a message conveyed.
We never repeat ourselves on this podcast, Robert.
Okay, well, I will do so.
No. Good. No, carry on. We just pretend that we never repeat ourselves.
No. It was Patrushev, who's a close aide of Putin, sent a pretty stiff message to the Trump entourage. Remember who put you in power.
Yes.
And it seems to me the messages are not absolutely clear, Bernard, on this. It may be that with Mr. Putin's economy struggling, that Mr. Trump doesn't take Putin as seriously as he once did. I don't know, but I still think that Mr. Trump's loyalty to Putin will shine through. But it is interesting. There's signs of tension now between Moscow and the Trump team, which is a bit of a surprise given the circumstances.
Robert, there's been we were talking about this during the week. There's a bit of a, there are so many intriguing international stories right now, and collapses of governments, changes of government. They're not all interlinked, but I think 2 or 3 of them are. So Georgia, Tbilisi, we had George Lomazadze, my lovely friend from there, on some weeks ago, talking about the clash between the president of Georgia and the government, which is heavily influenced and heavily on the side of Vladimir Putin. So we're seeing scenes in Georgia of absolutely enormous mass rallies against the government, with very strong, it's very much like, or it reminds me of Belarus, and it reminds me of the Maidan in Ukraine. And you've also got this phenomenon in Romania, where you've had an extreme right-winger who is essentially defending the fascist government of the 1940s, coming out as the leading candidate in the presidency evidently with significant Russian help.
Yeah, you get the feeling that for all his interfering overseas, that Mr. Trump may be facing considerable blowback. And I absolutely agree with your parallel between Ukraine in 2013 and Georgia in 2024. There seems to be a popular backlash. One thing that really seems to have rallied many Georgians was the pro-Russian government's decision to suspend negotiations with the EU into 2028. That sort of parallels where, just think
Yanukovych.
Yanukovych. When
You're supposed to be the bloody professor. I'm
sorry. Yeah, it's been a long day. Yanukovych postponed. No, he didn't postpone. He agreed to accept Putin's offer to shelve the EU trade deal, association trade deal, it's called, in 2013. And many Ukrainians were outraged by that. They saw this once again as Ukraine's desire to be linked more with the West as being thwarted by the Kremlin.
Yes.
So there's a sort of parallel thing going on in Georgia. Very interesting.
It is,
and
really
these people are
interesting.
quite brave who are protesting, by the way. You've probably seen the scenes of on the receiving end of pretty impressive
very
spraying
impressive
machines.
Russian. And my friend Natalia Antalava's going back there. George is still there. I'll try and get George possibly on the show next week. I mean, the situation in Romania is also very alarming. You've got Moldova, which just narrowly won, the president of Moldova just narrowly won her vote on trying to join the EU. Moldova, for those who don't know, is right on the edge of the northern Romania. It speaks Romanian. They have Romanian as their language. It's right on the front line of an area that we really don't think about adequately. It has a border with Ukraine. If people don't realize, well, actually, Robert, could you explain instead of me blurring, the geopolitical importance of Romania, Moldova, Lithuania, Poland? We're talking about the front line here.
Well, we're talking about countries which were formerly part of the Soviet Union, apart from Romania, which had independence, inverted commas, but was part of the Soviet bloc. But the Baltic states were certainly linked to the Soviet Union. So Mr. Putin has played the populist card in some of these countries, and the geopolitical significance is huge. I do get the feeling that Mr. Putin is getting a bit desperate in the Kremlin. He's not going to advertise that. He's winning the war, of course, according to all his supporters. But he does look very terse at the moment for a variety of reasons. And there's a lot at stake. Another country we haven't mentioned so far, apart from these struggles going on in Eastern Europe, is, of course, Syria. And this could have major reverberations for Putin's position in Syria, for Putin's position in Moscow.
So, in case everybody doesn't know, the rebel forces who were absolutely crushed by Russia, Russian forces helping Bashar al-Assad, have retaken the ruins of Aleppo. Who's backing those rebels? Is it Turkey?
It's a coalition. First of all, the rebels seem to be linked only by their opposition to Assad. There are rebels there who have actually formerly associated with Al-Qaeda, and some with Islamic State, and some that were formerly linked, Free Syria, with the United States. So there's quite a broad coalition. It doesn't actually bode well for the future stability of the country, because once Assad's taken out, if he's taken out the equation, which will be a huge blow for Putin. If that happens, it's very difficult to see how this coalition will avoid fracturing. It's Syria's in a terrible state, really. So
skipping through the Syria, Lebanon thing, there's a thing that underlines that, which is France, of course, historically. This is quite good, actually. This is almost. I know you're not a historian, literally, but we could do a half-hour historical podcast as well. And if people aren't careful, like Anne French, who's
we'll win the bronze prize. I will actually
talk about Romania and the Ceausescu period, having having worked in Romania for several years. But, Robert, we've also seen an extraordinary thing in France, which is the vote of no confidence in the Michel Barnier government, driven very heavily by Marine Le Pen, of course, and the National Rally people. Surely you have to think that Macron is literally vulnerable now, the president.
Yes, I think he is, because I think part of his gamble was, if you like, taking the early election and then an early election that delivered a very sizable National Front delegation or Le Pen representation, was that they would have to, in a sense, come in from the cold and take the heat in Parliament. And Barnier was seen as a shrewd political operator who could help, I think, bring that about. But it seems to be that Barnier is on the back foot at the moment. Yeah. And Le Pen is certainly seems to have some momentum. And
shall we remember who helped fund Le Pen?
Oh, I think it was a loan from Moscow.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah, so when everybody, because I've had this conversation sometimes with a particular relative of mine, but, Jesus Christ, they're no worse than the Americans. They're all doing. This is not the case. The Russians operate in very mysterious ways. Bernard, do you want to bring it back to AUKUS and housing?
Yes, I do. After noting that France's government bond yield for the first time was higher than the Greek government bond yield on Tuesday.
Which is not good.
No. But AUKUS,
could you explain, actually, Bernard, just quickly explain that to the audience about why that matters, because sometimes we gloss over these things, and sometimes we need to say the obvious thing too. Just explain why that is.
International investors think Greece is a better financial risk than France, which is right at the core of the European Union. And less than a decade ago, people thought that Greek would be kicked out of the euro because it was so hopeless. That's where we've got to. Robert, big news this week in AUKUS land with Labour coming out and saying not only would it not sign up to AUKUS if it was in government, but it would pull out if National had put us in before Labour got back in. What did you think of that?
I thought the timing was quite shrewd, given that Mr. Trump's now destined to be in the White House. And as we've said before, it would have been much easier in political terms to sell Pillar 2 if Kamala Harris administration was in AUKUS, in the White House. And with Mr. Trump there, the Labour Party have played their hand. And they haven't said it's got anything to do with Mr. Trump, but the subtext, I think, is that New Zealand shouldn't assume its interests are identical to the United States. And that is particularly the case now. The other thing I think was important about that announcement is that it certainly puts the pressure on the government to make the case. And that for up to now, the government has been saying, we're just simply sharing a bipartisan position of exploring AUKUS. I think this has been a new development in the debate. The other thing is, I was struck by Mr. Luxon's immediate reaction. I'm sure you heard it. He said it just shows how ridiculous the Labour Party is in jettisoning a bipartisan approach to AUKUS. But what is interesting is the Labour response was along the lines of, well, a lot has happened since the new government, the national-led government, has come in. Gaza's happened, which has driven a coach and horses through the idea that New Zealand's values are the same as the United States on a key area of the world. And secondly, we now have the prospect of a government forming in Washington that will put America head and shoulders above any multilateral or international agreements. So, in a sense, a lot has happened. I think the timing was quite good from the Labour point of view.
Yeah.
Had they taken this,
you mean?
Sorry?
Tactically, you mean?
Tactically, yes, because I think had they made this announcement earlier, it would have, before it was known about who was going to be in the White House, it would have been not so striking. But interesting, I don't think there's any connection, but Mr. Hipkins seems to be improving in the polls the last week or so. But yeah, it's an interesting development. In a sense, it exploits national-led coalition, the national-led coalition position, and this is a bipartisan point. I'm not trying to score political points here. I was always puzzled, and I think many other people were, why National insisted on closer alignment with traditional allies when it already had, thanks to the Labour predecessors, very good relations with both the United States
and China
and Australia. It was not as if, and also the UK. We just signed a free trade agreement, which I think former trade minister described as the gold standard. So in all three cases, we already had excellent relations. So how much more mileage can you get out of very good relations?
And good relations with China.
Yes.
Theoretically, if you don't.
That's
if you don't
true,
mess it up.
although they wobbled once or twice, didn't they, during the Labour period?
Robert, before you came in today, I was explaining that I was at an event last night of Helen Clark's, a couple of hundred people at her foundation, and there were several former diplomats, and this is not coming from Helen herself, and they were saying one of the things that they find interesting about Winston Peters, because of course he has been a very effective foreign minister a couple of times, but they found it intriguing and puzzling and a bit worrying that he has a kind of post-1945 reverence for the United States. What do you make of that?
I think it'll be more difficult for him to sustain that now, but he may well maintain it. The other thing is, though, to be fair to Winston Peters, he certainly sees himself as being on the American side of the ledger, so to speak. When he wants good relations with both China and the US, but maintaining a tilt towards the United States. But the interesting thing is, he does seem to have preserved a pretty cordial relationship with the Chinese leadership. So far, I would agree with that observation, but it hasn't generated any major diplomatic complications for the country so far. But I do think that excellent interview that Guy and Espiner did with the Chinese ambassador to New Zealand made it quite clear that the position taken by Mr. Luxon and Todd McClay, that there won't be consequences if we did join Pillar 2 of AUKUS. I think that was laid bare. I think the Chinese are saying, oh yes, there will be economic consequences for New Zealand if that goes ahead.
Robert, thank you so much. The audience is going wild for you. They love your comment about New Zealand shouldn't assume its interests are identical to the US. And thank you. And people last night were telling me how much they love you as well. So
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robert. We now welcome to the show. I guess we've had before, and we're really pleased to have him back on at short notice. Thank you very much, Troy, for joining us on the Hoon. Troy Basin is the co-president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists. Troy, what did you think of the news that came out yesterday about the Marsden Fund?
Well, my thinking was really that it couldn't get an awful lot worse. You know, really what we're doing here is making sure that in the absence of dealing with the report from Sir Peter Gluckman, which we've been waiting for months by a process involving a cabinet paper, which just is not appearing, we are going to break the one thing that's still working in the science system.
That's right. And I wonder about this, the process of how it was done as well. It seems to have been particularly abrupt, non-consultative, and shocking.
Well, I'm just going to speculate here that what happened is a little bit like some of the tobacco reform stuff involving Casey Costello.
They did their own research.
Piece of paper was inserted into a minister's office and suddenly became part of something that no one really expected. In fact, it's very hard to imagine something like this going through without either consulting the Royal Society that has to run it, or the universities that primarily have to administrate 90% or so of these Marsden grants. And none of them knew anything about it as far as we can tell. In fact, I'm also guessing from a few rumors I've heard that Sir Peter Gluckman knew nothing about this and was quite surprised.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, Troy, because I know Sir Peter Gluckman a little bit, and had, just full disclosure, I've done a couple of things with him on media reform. Both his reports of this new, so let's just to be clear, the audience may not know this, he's the former science advisor, and he's been commissioned to do a report on the state of science and the future of science in New Zealand. It's very clever.
Yeah.
Right.
Both aspects of his report are late.
No, his reports are on time. They're with the government.
Yeah.
They've
Oh, are
been
they?
with the
Oh, I
government
thought he
for
had to
some
deliver
time.
them
He's
still.
briefed people, including the New Zealand Association of Scientists.
Yep.
Lots of other people we've been able to talk to, politicians, have all heard from him. And we all agree, roughly at least 80% with what he has recommended that he could talk about. So there's no huge surprises in there. The big question is, for a government that promised, sort of ticking through this stuff in a fairly sort of business-like way, why are we not seeing any progress on this?
So, Troy, before Bernard, I was just about to message Bernard to say I had one more question for you. So just leave me, and then he'll wind up with you. But we talk a lot about social sciences. What do we talk? Social sciences and the humanities. Can you give us a non-academic or an academic even perspective on what we mean when we're talking about social sciences and humanities, and the range of, I mean, the way this will be portrayed, and I'm just tempted to say it would be portrayed in the New Zealand Herald, although I was puzzled that the New Zealand Herald used an RNZ story about this very important decision rather than anything of its own.
I was contacted by the reporter at the Herald that has the flu and couldn't
good.
write the story. So
Good. Well, they used
Yeah.
RNZ for the story, but this is not about moving away from basket weaving and Eritrean poetry. Tell us what we really mean by the humanities and social.
Yeah, a good example of a social scientist that you might know, you might even have on the Hoon, is somebody like Bronwyn Hayward, that studies politics and worries about how we get the political system in New Zealand working to solve climate change. People that work on the issues of how we're going to address and respond to hazards so that the people part of the system actually works. Now, the economics panel and the human behavior part of things does survive. But social science has been nixed, and maybe the harder one to explain would be humanities. Collectively, these sort of define who we are and how we actually work as a nation, and the humanities includes areas like philosophy and analyzing literature, which, if you are interested in how we actually use AI, you might want to use humanities for the analysis of
but Troy, there's no economic
robotics,
benefit in
right?
philosophy.
Yeah, and philosophy, I think that's very important, both in understanding how we respond to climate change, how we deal with Te Ao Māori and Te Tiriti, and we seem to be having a little bit of trouble with that lately. Plus, also AI, absolutely.
And it strikes me that it lacks imagination to think about the contribution of the arts and culture and humanities to a bunch of really big industries in New Zealand. The government itself subsidises the movie industry to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Do you think that completely ignoring the Hobbit trilogy and the works of art that's come out of Tolkien would have meant we had a movie industry, let alone all of the skills around telling stories? The most powerful things on the planet. It just beggars belief.
It really does. I mean, I think that's the way I describe it to people, is if we want to deal with the big problems, we need to understand how humans actually deal with them. And then we need to actually be able to tell the story. And that pretty much defines what we've just cut here. So that is absolutely shocking, including this more modern stuff like Moana. All that is... the foundation of that is going out the door and will increasingly not be supported in our university system. And keep in mind, the Business New Zealand reaction to this was the part that I most want to point out here. This was astounding. The notion that Business New Zealand, who Rebecca Stevenson, if you go back and think about the article she wrote about Luxon when he gave that speech in the UK in 2022 when he first became opposition leader. And everybody's thinking, what is he talking about, New Zealand business being soft? Well, what she was on about in that story was that New Zealand business does have a tendency to come looking for handouts from government, kind of like landlords, right? And
Oh, nice one, Troy.
going and looking for $80 million from the Marsden Fund when there's $1 billion going in other government research bodies that really should be addressing business, that are giving $300 million to universities without a lot of strings attached, more than that to CRIs, all of which address business and economic goals. Plus, there's nearly $500 million going in the research and development tax incentive that we have no idea what it's doing, and we know that it's not hiring hardly anybody with PhDs. So we might wonder if we should be trying to claw some of that money back from
what did
business.
PhDs ever do for us, really? What
Well,
did the Romans ever
I
do
don't
for us?
know. I try to tell you a few things, but the question is, does anybody listen? Yeah, I don't know. So, look, we're really kind of going
well,
backwards in multiple
this
directions
is the thing.
here.
And what surprises me about that's what surprises me is that you could argue, the big end of town civic society seems quiet on this. I would have thought that the likes of Peter Beck and our high-tech exporters who are using research like this, who are keeping these scientists, who want these scientists kept in New Zealand, because once they leave, they're not going to come back and do work for businesses. They will establish themselves in universities and other institutions overseas. I'm actually curious, Troy, what are you hearing from within the science community about what's happening to these people who have lost their jobs and what they're actually doing now and what they're planning?
Yeah, well, there's a mixture of things. I'm probably doing less than I could be, but I'm in a position where I can do that, and that makes me an excellent part of the commentariat, not deeply conflicted, and, largely able to be ready to address the things that I care about, which largely have to do with addressing climate change and other environmental issues. But most other people aren't doing that, and they're either having to kind of downscale what they're doing as jobs and stay in New Zealand, or many of them really are leaving New Zealand. We saw with the end of the National Science Challenges, a large proportion of the National Science Challenge directors had lined up overseas jobs before the National Science Challenges had even ended.
Troy, you've been absolutely brilliant on this, and the audience has really appreciated it. I mean, I think that, and forgive me for asking you such a moronic question as about explaining the humanities and social sciences, but it is important to be clear about the range of things that we are talking about. This seems to be, to me, such an anti-intellectual approach.
Look, and I think that is really important that we explain it here in a way that the audience to the Hoon can pass it on to others. And the last thing I'd say that makes very little sense about this is the Marsden Fund is a small amount of money that drives New Zealand's international reputation in research. And that, in turn, feeds back a huge amount of export education revenue that helps stabilize our universities as they are, which I have questions about whether that's the right way to do it. But as they are, they really need that. And they can grab some of that from Australia and the US decreasing its share of that market at the moment. So these are real opportunities for us that I'd expect the government to be taking advantage of rather than torpedoing.
Yes.
Thank you,
Troy
Troy.
Baston, the co-president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists, thank you so much for coming on to the Hoon again. Lovely to see you.
See you soon.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much, Bernard. Thanks.
Cheers.
And Bernard,
Well,
I
Peter,
just
that was
wanted to ask you, can I ask you a quick political question, please? Because
Go for it.
I think I said I was listening to the Jack Tame interview with Christopher Luxon, which was pathetic. By Christopher Luxon, not by Jack Tame. Although, what do we know officially from Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon what the agenda is here? What the percentage of government spending that they want to reduce is? What the debt that they want to get down to is? Do we know what's
we do
driving
know.
this?
Yeah, we do know there is an official fiscal strategy. It was released in the budget policy statement before the budget came out. The government's core goal, its North Star, is to get the government OBIGL, the operating budget, excluding budget gains and losses, the budget surplus, I suppose, or deficit, back into surplus by 2027-28. That's a year later than what they originally planned when they got elected. And they're also planning to reduce the size of government debt from around 40% of GDP to closer to 30%, and they want to see the size of government as a share of GDP
Yes.
drop from around 34% to 30%. So it's going to be the most extreme fiscal tightening in our history, more extreme than the 1990 to 1993 Ruth Richardson period. That's the advice they've had from Treasury, and that it will require massive cuts in spending growth, particularly in health. That's what we're seeing right now with, doctors not being employed, waiting times blowing out, people being rejected from getting onto waiting lists. That's the result of targeting a smaller
Bernard,
government.
but is there a genuine set of policy agendas behind this? Because I suspect that there are a number of policy agendas that we're not fully aware of, and that they get kind of air cover, if you like, from that, because what you just described, or as we see it being applied, is surely just constant salami slicing of virtually every government department.
Yeah, the overall philosophy is that small government is good, that government debt is bad, and that anything they can do to crunch down the size of government is going to make us all happier and healthier. The problem is that it's just not true. So we've had plenty of examples, particularly in the last 20 years or so, of austerity-led, debt reduction-led, crunch down the size of government-led policies. And the OECD, the IMF, and the World Bank have done proper studies of them. And there are large numbers of countries that have done this, sadly often on the advice of the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank. But anyway, and the result, it's incontrovertible, is that when a government tightens fiscal policy, so reduces government spending into a recession, when interest rates are high, it significantly reduces the size of GDP and makes the debt to GDP ratio, because the denominator is the one that's falling, and so you have to chase your own tail, it makes debt to GDP worse. So it's counterproductive.
Yes.
And it effectively achieves the exact opposite of what you say you want. And if anyone had looked at the advice or had been handed the advice from officials, they'd go, yes, Minister, but this has been tried before, and it's been tried before in New Zealand. Now, you could argue that the tightening from 1990 to 1993 was eventually successful. Have a chat to the people who were unemployed at the time. Also, have a chat to those people who saw 1990 as the pivot point where New Zealand started falling behind Australia in a substantial way. And also have a chat to Ruth Richardson, because she lost her job in 1993 because of the failure of that policy. Jim Bolger worked out eventually that this was killing his government, and we're now seeing finally the polls telling Christopher Luxon, Tai ho, this is not working, dude. Back off. Now, the debate I think we'll see in the next year will be within the National Caucus, asking themselves the question, are these bozos driving this government into a brick wall? And am I going to be a casualty of that? Do we need to change the drivers at the wheel? And Christopher Luxon, especially after that absolutely atrocious performance on Q&A, his role as Prime Minister and as leader of the National Caucus is now clearly in doubt, because he is not performing, he's not popular, and now his government is behind the opposition less than a year into government when he should have had a honeymoon. We'll see whether the opposition are able to take advantage of this, or whether they shoot themselves in the foot and each other in the head. We don't know. But I still think there's a high chance Christopher Luxon is rolled by his own caucus before the next election. And I think if the polls continue to deteriorate, as they have in the last 6 weeks, then it's all on in 2025.
So Bernard, you took one question from me and turned it into one of your soliloquies, which was elegant.
Oh, there you go.
But I think we have to be careful not to be a pair of nice, considerate socialist people who have a nice, considerate socialist audience. What did I predict to you this week in a note to you and Robert Patman about David Seymour?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good luck with it. Yeah, and I didn't agree with that, but I am certainly stranger things have happened. And
So I predicted that David Seymour would be the next Prime Minister. I mean, after the election, not when Christopher Luxon has rolled. Because I think we're in a dark phase. But maybe the Hikoi and everything changes that.
Yep.
Shall we do a skateboarding dog?
Chocolate fish. I'm happy to get a chocolate fish on that.
But what I've realised, and of course, weirdly, Sorry, Bernard. Go ahead, chocolate fish.
Chocolate fish, and I'm very keen on the skateboarding dog story.
Yes, well, also I noticed it at the beginning, and then some bugger on our audience has noticed that my shirt bears significant resemblance to your backdrop. but I guarantee that my shirt cost a lot more than your backdrop, as lovely as your backdrop is. So the thing I wanted to do for Skateboarding Dog, and it kind of reminds me of the conversation I had last night with Wayne Brown, and it's to read you the Thanksgiving message to the American public from Donald Trump last week, when we'd finished, I think, when he said this. Happy Thanksgiving to all, including the radical left lunatics who have worked so hard to destroy your country, but will have miserably failed and will always fail because their ideas and policies are so hopelessly bad that the great people of our nation just gave a landslide victory to those who want to make America great again. I mean, and if we don't think that's sort of bringing the country together, it's not.
No. Just imagine if Donald Trump had been in charge of the food when the pilgrims had run out. Can you imagine?
I think he would have eaten all the pies, but yeah.
Yeah, he would have eaten all the pies and the pumpkins and everything else.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
He got the colour of the pumpkins.
Yeah, and thank you, Bernard. You've been fabulous today. And thanks always, of course, to Simon Josie, our wonderful producer. And thank you, everybody. And I just loved seeing so many people last night at the Helen Clark event who are Hoon people. Thank you so much.
Yes, because the Hoon is always a hoot.
That's
Ka kite anō, everyone.
nice.
Okay, that's us. It looks like everyone has successfully uploaded. Shock horror. According to my system here,
1
view
second.
recordings.
Okay, we'll be back.